December 17, 1944, near Lanzerath, Belgium, 0530 hours, Lieutenant Gerhard Hoffmann of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division pressed himself into the frozen earth and tried to make sense of what his ears were telling him. His company had been advancing through the pre-dawn darkness of the Ardennes, part of the great offensive that would shatter the American lines and turn the tide of the war. Intelligence had reported a single American infantry platoon defending the crossroads ahead, 18 men, perhaps 20, a speed bump on the road to Antwerp. The sound coming from that crossroads was not the sound of 18 men. Rifle fire erupted in continuous waves, overlapping and unceasing, punctuated by the heavier bark of automatic weapons that seemed to multiply with every passing second. Hoffmann had fought in Italy, in France, at a dozen engagements across 2 years of war. He knew what small arms fire sounded like. He knew the rhythm of a platoon defending a position, the measured volleys, the pauses for reloading, the gaps that revealed the enemy's true strength. There were no gaps. The fire never slackened, never paused, never revealed the silence that should have betrayed a small unit's limitations. How many? Hauptmann Wolf Dietrich, the company commander, had crawled forward to Hoffmann's position, his face pale in the gray light. Hoffmann shook his head. A company at least. Perhaps a reinforced company. The volume of fire. He stopped, unable to articulate what he was hearing. It sounded like a battalion. It sounded like the Americans had hidden an entire battalion at a crossroads that reconnaissance had reported defended by a single platoon. "We need reinforcements," Dietrich said. "We cannot assault a position of this strength with a single company." The request went up the chain of command. The advance stalled. German units that should have been racing through the gap in American lines stopped to await artillery support for an attack against what their officers estimated as a reinforced American company, possibly a battalion. The position was held by 18 men, 18 American soldiers with M1 Garands, Browning automatic rifles, and a handful of machine guns, a single understrength platoon that had been written off by American commanders as a sacrificial rearguard. They held for nearly 20 hours. They inflicted over 90 casualties on the German paratroopers. They delayed an advance that was supposed to sweep through in minutes, buying time for American reinforcements to organize the defense that would eventually stop the entire Ardennes offensive. And they did it by sounding like an army. What Lieutenant Hoffmann experienced at Lanzerath, what German officers experienced at 1,000 engagements across France, Italy, and Germany, was not a trick or a deception. It was doctrine. American infantry had been trained to produce volumes of fire that European armies associated only with much larger formations. Every rifleman carried a weapon that fired as fast as he could pull the trigger. Every squad operated with the assumption that fire superiority was the prerequisite to all tactical success. Every engagement began with a wall of lead designed to overwhelm, suppress, and psychologically devastate the enemy before maneuver ever commenced. The Germans had perfected infantry tactics built around the machine gun, with riflemen supporting the crew-served weapon that provided the unit's killing power. The Americans had inverted this logic. They had made every rifleman a source of suppressive fire, every squad a mobile fire base, every platoon a formation that could generate the volume of fire that German doctrine required a company to produce. The result was a persistent, maddening intelligence failure. German commanders consistently overestimated the American forces they faced, called for reinforcements against phantoms, and delayed advances that might have succeeded if they had understood what they were actually fighting. They were fighting a new kind of infantry, an infantry that had learned to sound bigger than it was. And by the time they understood this, it was far too late. German infantry doctrine was not merely effective, it was revolutionary, the product of 2 decades of systematic analysis that had transformed the lessons of the First World War into the most sophisticated small unit tactics in the world. The Wehrmacht's approach to infantry combat rested on a single, elegant principle. The machine gun was the decisive weapon, and everything else existed to serve it. A German infantry squad was not a collection of riflemen with a machine gun attached. It was a machine gun team with riflemen attached, 9 men whose primary purpose was to position, protect, supply, and support the MG-34 or MG-42 that provided the squad's killing power. The machine gun is the backbone of the infantry, wrote General Major Ludwig Kubler in the 1940 edition of Der Infanterieangriff, the standard tactical manual for Wehrmacht ground forces. Riflemen provide security, reconnaissance, and close protection. They carry ammunition. They suppress enemy positions at close range. But the machine gun delivers the volume of fire that breaks enemy resistance. Without it, the squad is a collection of individuals. With it, the squad is a weapon. The mathematics supported this philosophy absolutely. An MG-42 fired 1,200 rounds per minute, 20 rounds per second, a rate so fast that individual shots blurred into a continuous tearing sound that Allied soldiers called Hitler's buzzsaw. A single machine gun crew of 2 or 3 men could produce more fire than an entire platoon of riflemen. In defensive positions, a well-sighted MG-42 could hold off a company. In offensive operations, the machine gun's suppressive fire allowed riflemen to maneuver against positions that would otherwise have been impregnable. German tactical intelligence had learned to estimate enemy strength based on this understanding. Analysts counted machine gun positions, multiplied by expected supporting riflemen, and calculated the forces they faced. The formulas were sophisticated, tested in combat across 3 continents, and accurate within acceptable margins when applied to European armies. The British fought this way. Their infantry section centered on the Bren gun, a light machine gun that anchored the unit's firepower. The Soviets fought this way, with the DP-28 serving a similar function in Red Army squads. Even the French, before their collapse, had organized their infantry around the doctrine of crew-served weapons, supported by riflemen. The machine gun was the universal grammar of modern infantry combat, and German tactical intelligence read enemy positions like a language they had long since mastered. We could estimate American strength within 10% by counting automatic weapons, recalled Oberst Heinrich Kramer, an intelligence officer with Army Group B in France. Every army organized the same way. Machine guns for suppression, riflemen for support and maneuver. Count the machine guns, multiply by 8 or 10, and you knew what you faced. This methodology had been validated across 4 years of war. We had no reason to question it. The methodology produced consistently accurate estimates against British forces in North Africa and Italy. It produced accurate estimates against Soviet formations on the Eastern Front. It would fail catastrophically against American infantry because American infantry did not organize the way other armies organized. But in 1942, when American forces first engaged the Wehrmacht in significant numbers, German intelligence had no reason to suspect this. They analyzed American tables of organization. They noted that American squads included a Browning automatic rifle, a light automatic weapon comparable to the Bren gun or the DP-28. They assumed the BAR served the same tactical function as other armies' squad automatic weapons, the anchor of fire around which riflemen maneuvered. They assumed, in other words, that the American squad was a machine gun team with riflemen attached. The assumption was logical, it was consistent with every other army the Wehrmacht had fought, and it was profoundly, disastrously wrong. What German intelligence failed to understand, what their analytical frameworks could not accommodate, was that American infantry doctrine did not distinguish between suppressive fire and aimed fire. Every American rifleman carried a weapon capable of producing suppressive fire. Every American rifleman was trained to deliver that fire from the opening moment of contact. The bar was not the anchor of the American squad's firepower. It was merely the largest gun in a squad where every gun was expected to contribute to the same continuous, overwhelming volume of fire. The Germans had built their infantry around a single dominant weapon supported by riflemen. The Americans had built their infantry around riflemen who were all dominant weapons. The difference would manifest as a persistent, systematic intelligence failure that colored every engagement of the European war. German commanders would call for reinforcements against American platoons they believed were companies. They would request artillery against companies they believed were battalions. They would hesitate, delay, and overestimate at moments when aggression might have carried the day. And they would never understand, until the war was lost and the interrogators began their work, that the sound they were hearing was not the sound of superior numbers. It was the sound of superior doctrine. A doctrine that made every American soldier a weapon unto himself. The doctrine that would confound German intelligence was born in the red clay of Georgia, in the minds of officers who had watched the First World War consume a generation and sworn to never repeat its mistakes. Fort Benning, established in 1918, became the laboratory where American infantry tactics were invented, tested, and refined. The infantry school, located on its grounds, trained every infantry officer in the U.S. Army and shaped the thinking of a generation of commanders. In the 1920s and 1930s, while European armies debated the lessons of Verdun and the Somme, Benning's instructors developed a philosophy that would prove devastatingly effective against those same European armies. The architect of this philosophy was a lean, intense colonel named George C. Marshall. Marshall served as assistant commandant of the infantry school from 1927 to 1932, 5 years that would shape the American way of war more profoundly than any battle. He gathered around him a faculty of unconventional thinkers: Joseph Stilwell, who would later command in Burma; Omar Bradley, who would lead armies in Europe; J. Lawton Collins, who would earn the nickname Lightning Joe for the speed of his operations. Together, they examined infantry combat with the detachment of scientists and the urgency of men who knew another war was coming. The problem of modern infantry is simple to state and difficult to solve, Marshall wrote in a 1929 memorandum that circulated among his faculty. The defender has an inherent advantage in firepower. A man behind cover with a clear field of fire can kill many attackers before they reach his position. The Great War proved this beyond doubt. Our task is to develop tactics that neutralize this advantage, that allow attacking infantry to generate sufficient firepower to suppress defensive positions while simultaneously maneuvering against them. The answer Marshall and his colleagues developed was radical. Democratize firepower. Instead of concentrating killing power in crew-served weapons, distribute it across every man in the squad. Train every rifleman to deliver rapid, accurate fire from the moment of contact. Make suppression not the job of the machine gun team, but the job of the entire unit. Every soldier a marksman had been an American military tradition since the Revolution. Marshall transformed it into every soldier a source of suppressive fire. The doctrine required a weapon that could deliver rapid aimed fire, and in 1936, John Garand provided one. The M1 rifle was not merely a technical improvement over the Springfield bolt action it replaced. It was a doctrinal enabler, a weapon that made Marshall's vision tactically feasible. A rifleman with a Garand could fire 40 to 50 aimed rounds per minute. A 12-man squad equipped with Garands could produce nearly 600 rounds per minute of aimed rifle fire alone, before accounting for the BAR, before accounting for any attached machine guns. This was more fire than a German squad could produce with its entire complement of weapons. It was more fire than European tactical theory assumed infantry could generate. It was, in effect, a new kind of infantry, one that European armies had no framework to understand. Colonel Gruber Whitfield, who supervised infantry weapons training at Fort Benning from 1938 to 1941, later described the doctrinal revolution in a post-war interview. The European model placed the machine gun at the center and arranged everything else around it. We inverted this. We placed the rifleman at the center and treated the automatic weapons as supplements to his firepower rather than replacements for it. Every man was expected to contribute to the squad's volume of fire. Every man was trained to engage targets from the first moment of contact. When you put 12 Garand-equipped soldiers in a firefight, you got a volume of fire that European doctrine associated with a platoon or a company. The training reflected this philosophy. American infantry spent hours on the range learning rapid-fire techniques, engaging multiple targets in sequence, reloading without conscious thought, maintaining accuracy while firing at maximum speed. They practiced marching fire, advancing toward enemy positions while delivering continuous suppressive fire, a technique that European armies considered wasteful and undisciplined. The Germans would have called it spray and pray, recalled Sergeant Major Theodore Williams, who trained infantry replacements at Fort Benning in 1943. They believed in aimed fire, deliberate fire, conservation of ammunition. We believed in volume of fire. Hit them so hard and so fast that they can't shoot back. Keep hitting them while you close the distance. Never let the fire slacken. It burned through ammunition at a terrifying rate, but ammunition was something we had. Time under fire was something we wanted to minimize. The doctrine was tested in maneuvers across Louisiana, the Carolinas, and California in 1940 and 1941. The results surprised even its advocates. Blue Force infantry units employing the new tactics consistently overwhelmed Red Force defenders, generating volumes of fire that umpires struggled to adjudicate because their assessment frameworks assumed European rates of fire. Lieutenant Colonel James Gruber, an observer at the Louisiana maneuvers of 1941, wrote a report that would prove prophetic. Our infantry generates firepower at rates that existing tactical models do not anticipate. In repeated exercises, defending units reported contact with forces 2 to 3 times larger than actually present. This misestimation is consistent across observers and conditions. It appears to be a function of the volume of fire rather than any deliberate deception. Our squads simply sound bigger than they are. If enemy forces rely on sound-based estimates of American strength, as all armies do to some degree, they will consistently overestimate the forces they face. This suggests a significant tactical advantage in defensive operations, where apparent strength may deter attacks, and in offensive operations, where the enemy may commit reserves against phantoms. The report was filed and largely forgotten. American military planners had more pressing concerns in late 1941, but the phenomenon Gruber identified was real. American infantry had become something new, a force that violated the assumptions underlying European tactical intelligence, a force that sounded like more than it was, a force that would confound German analysts from North Africa to the Elbe. The doctrine was set, the weapons were issued, the training was complete. All that remained was to meet the enemy and demonstrate what American infantry had become. The Germans would learn the lesson at Kasserine, at Anzio, at Normandy, at 1,000 nameless crossroads across the European theater. They would learn it the hard way. The first lessons were humiliating. Kasserine Pass, February 1943. The first major engagement between American and German ground forces. American infantry arrived with their Garands and their doctrine and their confidence, and were promptly shattered by Wehrmacht veterans who had spent 3 years perfecting the art of combined arms warfare. The problem was not firepower. American units at Kasserine generated volumes of fire that surprised and impressed German observers. The problem was everything else. Coordination failed. Infantry units advanced without artillery support, generating impressive small arms fire against positions that should have been suppressed by 105mm howitzers. Communications collapsed. Battalions lost contact with regiments. Companies lost contact with battalions. Squads fought alone in the Tunisian hills without understanding what was happening on their flanks. Leadership crumbled. Officers, who had trained for years in peacetime maneuvers, discovered that German tanks and German artillery and German infiltration tactics created chaos that no training exercise had prepared them to manage. They shoot well. Oberst Hans-Georg Hildebrandt of the 10th Panzer Division wrote in his after-action report on Kasserine, "Better than the British in terms of volume. Individual American soldiers deliver rapid, accurate fire and do not panic under initial contact. But their tactical coordination is abysmal. They do not support their infantry with armor. They do not integrate artillery into their defensive positions. They fight as individuals and small units rather than as a coherent force. The firepower is impressive. The application is amateurish. The assessment was harsh and accurate. American forces at Kasserine suffered over 6,000 casualties, including nearly 300 killed and over 3,000 captured. They lost 183 tanks, 104 half-tracks, and 208 artillery pieces. They retreated over 50 miles before the German advance finally outran its supply lines and halted. German propaganda celebrated the victory as proof of American weakness. Wehrmacht intelligence officers drew conclusions that would haunt them for the next 2 years. American infantry generated high volumes of fire but could not stand against determined assault. American commanders lacked experience and judgment. American logistics, impressive on paper, could not sustain operations under pressure. The Americans are not serious soldiers, General Major Friedrich von Broich wrote after Kasserine. They have equipment and enthusiasm, but lack the discipline and tactical sophistication that real warfare demands. Their infantry fires wildly and without effect. Their officers panic when plans fail. They will require years of combat experience before they can meet German forces on equal terms. The confidence was understandable. Kasserine had been a German victory by any measure, but the assessment contained a fatal flaw. It dismissed the firepower rather than analyzing what that firepower might accomplish in more competent hands. American commanders did not dismiss it. They studied Kasserine with brutal honesty, cataloging failures, relieving officers who had not measured up, rebuilding units that had broken. General Eisenhower sacked the corps commander responsible for the defeat. General Omar Bradley assumed command of 2nd Corps with orders to make American infantry into something the Germans would fear. "We got whipped at Kasserine," Bradley wrote in his diary. "Whipped because we were green, whipped because we didn't coordinate, whipped because we thought firepower alone would save us. It won't. But firepower properly employed, firepower integrated with maneuver, with artillery, with armor support, that's something else. That's what we're going to build." The rebuilding took months. American units in Tunisia cycled through intensive training programs that emphasized combined arms coordination. Infantry learned to call for artillery. Artillery learned to respond within minutes rather than hours. Armor learned to support infantry advances rather than racing ahead into ambushes. The doctrine of fire superiority remained central, but it was integrated into a larger tactical framework that could exploit the advantages that firepower provided. The Germans noticed the improvement but underestimated its significance. "The Americans are learning," acknowledged Major Victor Linneman of the Africa Corps Intelligence Section in a May 1943 assessment. "Their coordination has improved since Kasserine. They are more cautious, more deliberate. But they remain fundamentally dependent on material superiority. When we can achieve local numerical parity, when we can concentrate forces against isolated American units, we prevail. Their firepower is a crutch that compensates for tactical deficiency. Remove the crutch, and they fall." The analysis missed the critical development. American firepower was not a crutch compensating for weak tactics. It was becoming the foundation of a tactical system that would prove devastatingly effective once all the pieces aligned. At El Ghoutar, in March 1943, American infantry, supported by properly coordinated artillery, destroyed an attack by the 10th Panzer Division, the same unit that had swept through Kasserine. The German assault columns advanced into a wall of rifle and automatic weapons fire so dense that survivors described it as walking into a hailstorm. The attack cost the Germans 38 tanks and over 600 casualties. American losses were minimal. "Something has changed," Linneman wrote in his revised assessment. "The American infantry at El Ghoutar fought with a ferocity and discipline we did not observe at Kasserine. The volume of fire was extraordinary, sustained, accurate, and unrelenting. Our assault troops could not advance through it. This is not the same enemy we faced 2 months ago." He was correct. It was not the same enemy. The Americans had taken their doctrine of firepower and learned to use it properly. They had integrated it with artillery support that could break up German formations before they reached assault distance. They had coordinated it with armor that could exploit gaps created by suppressive fire. They had trained leaders who understood when to pour on fire and when to maneuver. The pieces were coming together. Sicily would refine them further. Italy would hone them to a killing edge. By the time American infantry landed at Normandy, they would be ready. The Germans, still relying on assessments built at Kasserine, had no idea what was coming. July 11th, 1944, near Saint-Jean-de-Day, Normandy. 0615 hours. Staff Sergeant William Reeves of the 29th Infantry Division's 116th Regiment lay in a hedgerow ditch, watching the German assault form in the field beyond. 3 weeks after D-Day, the bocage had become a killing ground. A maze of sunken lanes and ancient hedgerows where visibility dropped to yards, and engagements happened at ranges that made rifles into shotguns. The Germans were coming in force. Reeves counted at least 40 soldiers, 2 full platoons of the 352nd Infantry Division, veterans who had manned the bluffs at Omaha Beach and knew this terrain intimately. They were forming up behind a hedgerow 150 yards distant organizing for an assault that would sweep through Reeves's position and roll up the American line. Reeves had 11 men, one squad, understrength from 3 weeks of continuous combat, 1 bar, 10 Garands, no machine gun, no mortar, no artillery support. The radio had died 2 days ago and hadn't been replaced. "How many?" Private First Class Danny Kowalski asked, his voice tight. "Doesn't matter," Reeves said. "When they come, everyone fires. Everything you have. Don't stop for anything. Make them think they walked into a battalion." The words were not bravado. They were doctrine. The same doctrine Reeves had learned at Fort Benning. The same doctrine that had been drilled into every rifleman in the American infantry. When contact was made, volume of fire was everything. Suppress the enemy before he could suppress you. Make him keep his head down. Make him believe he was outnumbered. Make him afraid. The German officer's whistle shrilled across the morning air. The assault rose from cover, 40 men advancing in short rushes, covering fire crackling from the far hedgerow. "Now," Reeves said. 11 Garands opened fire simultaneously. The sound was not the sound of a squad defending a position. It was a roar, continuous, overlapping, building on itself as each man emptied his 8-round clip and slammed in another. Reeves fired as fast as he could pull the trigger, shifted to the next target, fired again, shifted again. Beside him, Kowalski's BAR added its deeper bark to the cacophony, stitching rounds across the advancing German line. The first wave faltered after 4 seconds. Men dropped. Reeves counted 3, 4, 5 bodies in the open ground, and the survivors went to earth, seeking cover in the drainage furrows that crisscrossed the field. Return fire snapped overhead, but it was scattered, uncoordinated, the reflexive response of men who had expected to assault a weak position and found themselves pinned instead. "Keep firing!" Reeves shouted. "Don't let them move!" The volume never slackened. 11 men produced a wall of fire that swept the field in continuous waves, denying cover, denying movement, denying thought. The Germans tried to advance twice more in the next 3 minutes. Both times, they rose into a hailstorm that drove them back down before they could take 5 steps. And then they broke. Reeves watched it happen. Watched the moment when 40 trained German infantry, veterans of 4 years of war, decided that the position they faced was too strong to assault. They began crawling backward, dragging wounded, abandoning dead, retreating toward the hedgerow they had started from. A German sergeant, Reeves could see his rank insignia, screamed orders, trying to rally his men for another push. A burst from Kowalski's bar cut him nearly in half. The retreat became a rout. The survivors vanished behind the far hedgerow, leaving 11 bodies in the field and a silence that rang in Reeves' ears like a bell. "Did we?" Kowalski started. "Reload," Reeves said. "They'll be back with more." They came back 2 hours later. This time, they brought a full company, over 120 men, supported by 2 MG-42 teams and a mortar section. They advanced behind a preparatory barrage that cratered the hedgerow and wounded 3 of Reeves's remaining soldiers. The assault lasted 9 minutes. The American squad, now down to 8 effectives, produced the same unrelenting fire as before. The German company commander, Hauptmann Otto Bruckner, later provided testimony that captured the experience. "We had been told the position was held by a platoon, perhaps a reinforced squad. Intelligence reported light resistance, minor casualties from the morning assault. What we encountered was not a platoon. The volume of fire exceeded anything I had experienced since the Eastern Front. My lead squads were pinned within seconds of crossing the line of departure. I committed my reserve platoon, and they were pinned as well. The American fire never paused. It never slackened. There was no rhythm, no gap in which my machine gun teams could establish suppressing fire. I requested artillery support. I was told I faced a minor blocking position that should be cleared with organic infantry assets. I told the battalion commander that I was facing a company at minimum, possibly a reinforced company with extensive automatic weapons. He did not believe me. I lost 34 men trying to convince him I was correct. The position held until American reinforcements arrived that evening. By then, Reeves had 4 men left. 4 men who had held off 2 company-strength assaults and inflicted nearly 50 casualties on attacking German forces. "They thought we were a battalion," Reeves said later when the battalion commander asked how they had survived. "That's the trick. You fire so fast and so hard that they can't count muzzle flashes. They hear 100 rifles. They plan for 100 rifles, and when they find out it was 11 guys in a ditch, it's too late. They've already lost. The phenomenon was not isolated. Across the hedgerow country, in the brutal weeks between D-Day and the breakout at St. Lo, American squads routinely held positions against forces that outnumbered them 3 and 4 to 1. German after-action reports consistently overestimated the strength of American defenders. Requests for reinforcement flooded German battalion and regimental headquarters. Requests based on sound analysis of the fire they were receiving. Requests that were entirely logical given the volume of fire American infantry produced. General Lieutenant Dietrich Kreis, commander of the 352nd Infantry Division until his death on August 6, 1944, addressed the phenomenon in a report that reached Army Group B headquarters in late July. American defensive positions generate firepower disproportionate to their apparent strength. Standard reconnaissance methods, observation, patrol contact, prisoner interrogation, consistently underestimate the volume of fire these positions can produce. This leads to assault planning based on inaccurate assessments of enemy capability. Recommend adjustment of all force estimates against American infantry upward by factor of 2 to 3. The recommendation was sound. It was also impossible to implement systematically because German commanders could not adjust their mental models fast enough. They had spent years learning that volume of fire correlated with numbers of troops. They had built their tactical intelligence on this assumption, and they could not unlearn it, could not accept that the sound of 100 rifles might come from 11 men in a ditch with weapons that fired faster than their minds could process. The bocage had become a proving ground for American doctrine. Every hedgerow, every sunken lane, every miserable crossroads became a demonstration that fire superiority worked, that 11 Americans could hold against 40 Germans, that 8 could hold against 120, that the mathematics of European warfare no longer applied when every rifle sounded like a machine gun. The Germans were beginning to understand, but understanding came at the cost of casualties they could not afford and time they did not have. And the breakout was coming. Operation Cobra shattered the German lines on July 25, 1944, and American infantry poured through the gap like water through a broken dam. What followed was not merely a pursuit. It was a demonstration of what American infantry doctrine could accomplish when unleashed from the hedgerow stalemate, a rolling thunder of firepower and movement that collapsed German defensive positions faster than Wehrmacht commanders could comprehend. The pattern repeated across 100 engagements. American columns would encounter a German blocking position, a hasty defense thrown together by retreating units, a village fortified overnight, a crossroads held by a company ordered to delay at all costs. German commanders would estimate the approaching American force based on the fire they received. They would call for reinforcements, request artillery, prepare for an assault by the battalion or regiment they believed they faced, and then an American company would overrun them. The mathematics broke, recalled Hauptmann Werner Lange of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, captured near Mortain in August 1944. We had been taught to estimate enemy strength by volume of fire. A company produces a certain volume, a battalion produces more, a regiment more still. The Americans violated this logic. Their companies produced fire like our battalions. Their battalions produced fire like our regiments. Every estimate we made was wrong. Every defense we prepared was inadequate. The problem compounded as the German army retreated. Experienced officers who understood the American advantage were killed or captured. Their replacements, rushed forward from training units and rear area commands, arrived with textbook knowledge that bore no relationship to the enemy they actually faced. Lieutenant Friedrich Kessler, a 20-year-old platoon leader who reached the front in September 1944, described his first engagement in a letter that was later captured. We were told to expect an American patrol, perhaps a reinforced squad probing our lines. I positioned my men according to doctrine. We had good fields of fire. We were prepared for 20, perhaps 30 Americans. The firing began at 0630. Within seconds, I understood that our intelligence was wrong. The volume of fire was beyond anything I had trained for. I counted muzzle flashes. I tried to count them, but they overlapped and merged until counting was impossible. My machine gun team was suppressed before they could fire a full belt. My riflemen could not raise their heads to aim. I called for reinforcements. I reported that we faced at least a company, possibly more. Battalion informed me that the approaching force was a single American platoon conducting a reconnaissance in force. A platoon, 35 men. They produced fire that I would have sworn came from 150. My position collapsed in 11 minutes. I survived because an American medic found me in a ditch and chose to treat my wounds rather than leave me to die. Nothing we were taught prepared us for this. Nothing. The American advantage manifested not only in defense, but in attack. The doctrine of marching fire, advancing while delivering continuous suppressive fire, allowed American infantry to close with German positions while keeping defenders pinned. European armies considered this tactic wasteful, undisciplined, a sign of poor training. The Germans discovered it was devastatingly effective. Oberfeldwebel Hans Gruber of the 116th Panzer Division witnessed an American assault near Aachen in October 1944. They came out of the tree line firing, not running, then stopping to fire, then running again, the way we had been trained, firing while moving, every man, continuously. The noise was indescribable. My squad could not return effective fire because we could not expose ourselves long enough to aim. The Americans crossed 200 meters of open ground in less than 2 minutes, and by the time they reached our trench, half my men were dead or wounded, and the rest were too stunned to resist. Afterwards, I examined their weapons, semi-automatic rifles, every one of them. We had known about these rifles. We had been told they existed, but we had not understood what they meant. They meant that every American soldier was a machine gunner. They meant that our tactics, built around the superiority of the MG-42, were obsolete. They meant that we could not win a firefight against an enemy who could produce as much fire as we could with half the men. The Hürtgen forest amplified the effect. In the dense woods along the German border, engagement ranges dropped to meters. The machine gun's range advantage disappeared. What remained was volume of fire at close quarters. And in that environment, American infantry excelled. Gefreiter Wilhelm Brenner fought in the Hürtgen for 6 weeks before his capture in November 1944. His interrogation testimony revealed the psychological toll of facing American firepower in confined terrain. The forest was hell, visibility of 10 meters, sometimes less. Artillery splintered trees into shrapnel that killed men in their foxholes. And the Americans were everywhere. You would hear firing and try to estimate their position, their strength. The firing sounded like a company. You would prepare for a company. Then 8 men would emerge from the fog, firing rifles that never stopped, and your squad would cease to exist. I stopped trusting my ears. I stopped trusting my training. I stopped trusting anything except the need to keep my head down and pray that the Americans passed by my position. I had fought in Russia. I had fought against partisans. Nothing was like fighting Americans in the forest. Nothing. The Battle of the Bulge, December 1944, provided the final proof. German planners designed the Ardennes offensive around a fundamental assumption. American units, surprised and outnumbered, would collapse as they had collapsed at Kasserine. Initial German breakthroughs seemed to confirm this assumption. Panic spread through rear area units. Roads clogged with retreating vehicles. The offensive appeared to be succeeding beyond expectations. Then the Germans encountered American infantry that refused to break. At Bastogne, at Elsenborn Ridge, at St. Vith, at 100 small crossroads and village squares across the Ardennes, American infantry dug in and produced volumes of fire that stopped German assaults cold. Units that should have been overwhelmed held for hours, then days. Units that should have retreated stood and fought until relief arrived or ammunition ran out. The 18 men at Lanzerath held for 20 hours against a division. A single company at Dom-Bütgenbach repulsed repeated attacks by the 12th SS Panzer Division, inflicting over 300 casualties. Surrounded paratroopers at Bastogne answered a German surrender demand with a single word: nuts, and proceeded to demonstrate why the demand had been foolish in the first place. General Major Heinz Kokott, commander of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division at Bastogne, filed an after-action report that captured the German experience. American defensive firepower exceeded all projections. Positions that our intelligence estimated as company strength generated fire consistent with battalion or regimental formations. Assault tactics that had succeeded against Soviet and British forces failed repeatedly against American infantry. The cause appears to be their semi-automatic rifles, which provide individual soldiers with firepower previously associated only with automatic weapons. Our casualties in the Bastogne sector exceeded 5,000 men in 2 weeks of operations. We never penetrated the American perimeter. Their firepower made penetration impossible. The Bulge was contained, then crushed. The Wehrmacht's last offensive in the West broke against American infantry that sounded like an army because, in effect, it was an army where every rifleman was a weapon system, every squad was a fire base, every platoon generated the volume of fire that German doctrine reserved for companies. By January 1945, German commanders had finally adjusted their estimates. Intelligence reports began noting that American units should be assessed at double their apparent strength for purposes of planning. Assault planners were instructed to assume firepower 3 times greater than equivalent German units could produce. The adjustments came too late. The war had already turned, and the doctrine that had confounded German intelligence from Kasserine to the Bulge was about to chase the Wehrmacht back to Berlin, one overwhelming volley at a time. The statistics accumulate into an indictment of German intelligence that no post-war analysis could explain away. Across the European theater of operations, German commanders overestimated American infantry strength by an average factor of 2.3, meaning that a force assessed as a battalion typically turned out to be a company. A force assessed as a regiment typically turned out to be a battalion. This systematic inflation was not the result of poor intelligence work. It was the logical consequence of applying European analytical frameworks to an enemy that had rewritten the rules of infantry firepower. The consequences of these overestimates rippled through every level of German operations. Reserves were committed against phantom formations. Defensive lines were established based on threat assessments that bore no relationship to reality. Counterattacks were delayed while commanders awaited reinforcements to meet forces that did not exist. U.S. Army historical analysts estimated that German overestimation of American strength added an average of 4.7 hours to the resolution of contested engagements, hours during which American forces consolidated positions, brought up supplies, and prepared for the next phase of operations. Across thousands of engagements over 2 years, these hours accumulated into weeks of additional time, weeks that translated directly into lives saved and objectives achieved. The ammunition expenditure told its own story. American infantry in the European theater expended approximately 25,000 rounds of small arms ammunition for every enemy soldier killed, a figure that horrified efficiency-minded analysts but validated the doctrine of fire superiority. German infantry, by contrast, expended approximately 7,000 rounds per kill, a ratio that reflected their emphasis on aimed fire and ammunition conservation. But the German ratio was achieved while losing the war. The American ratio was achieved while winning it. Ammunition is cheap, General Omar Bradley observed in a 1945 staff conference. Soldiers are not. If we can suppress an enemy position with 1,000 rounds and take it without casualties, that is a better trade than suppressing it with 100 rounds and losing 3 men in the assault. The Germans never understood this. They counted bullets. We counted lives. The post-war interrogations produced testimony that confirmed what the statistics suggested. German tactical intelligence had been systematically deceived by American firepower from first contact to final surrender. Generaloberst Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations for the Wehrmacht High Command, addressed the phenomenon directly during his interrogation at Nuremberg. Our intelligence consistently overestimated American infantry strength. This was not incompetence. Our analysts were professionals who had accurately assessed British, French, and Soviet forces throughout the war. The error was systematic and arose from the fundamental difference in American infantry doctrine. We built our estimates on sound analysis. We counted automatic weapons, observed rates of fire, calculated probable strength based on these observations. The methodology was valid, but the Americans had changed the variables. Their riflemen produced fire we associated with automatic weapons. Their squads produced fire we associated with platoons. Every estimate we made was mathematically correct and tactically wrong. By the time we understood the source of the error, we lacked the resources to adapt. We could not re-equip our infantry with semi-automatic rifles. We could not retrain our analysts to use different calculations. We could only accept that the Americans had found a way to multiply their effective strength through doctrine and technology, and that we had no answer for it. General Major Friedrich von Mellenthin, who served as a senior intelligence officer on multiple fronts, provided analysis that cut to the heart of the German failure. The American infantry represented a doctrinal innovation we failed to recognize until too late. European armies, including our own, had organized infantry around the machine gun for 30 years. We assumed this organization was optimal. We assumed all modern armies would follow the same pattern. The Americans rejected this assumption. They built their infantry around the individual rifleman, equipped with a weapon that generated firepower previously achievable only by crew-served weapons. The result was an infantry force that sounded larger than it was, that fought with an intensity we did not expect, and that consistently surprised our tactical commanders with capabilities that exceeded all estimates. I have studied this phenomenon extensively since the war. I believe it represents one of the most significant tactical innovations of the 20th century. Not the weapon itself, which was merely a technical achievement, but the doctrine that exploited the weapon's potential. The Americans understood that volume of fire had psychological effects beyond its physical lethality. They understood that an enemy who believes he faces a battalion will fight differently than an enemy who knows he faces a company. They weaponized this understanding in a way that no European army had conceived. Oberst Heinrich Kramer, the intelligence officer who had confidently estimated American strength by counting automatic weapons, reflected on his failures with painful honesty. I was trained in the best military intelligence tradition in the world. I had accurately estimated enemy forces across 4 years of war on 3 continents, and I was consistently, catastrophically wrong about American infantry. The first time I realized the magnitude of my error was in the hedgerow country in Normandy. I assessed a defensive position as company strength based on the volume of fire it produced. We committed a battalion to assault it. The position was held by 2 squads, 24 men. 24 men produced fire that I, with all my training and experience, assessed as coming from over 100. I adjusted my estimates. I began doubling, then tripling my calculations when facing American forces. Even then, I was often wrong. The Americans had found a way to make their soldiers sound like an army, and I never fully developed a methodology that could pierce this acoustic deception. The enlisted men's testimony was equally revealing. Feldwebel Otto Brenner, who fought from Normandy to the Elbe, described the psychological experience of facing American firepower. You learn to estimate strength by sound. After enough combat, you can hear the difference between a squad and a platoon and a company, the rhythm of fire, the overlapping of volleys, the density of the noise. These things tell you what you face. Against the Americans, this skill became useless. Their squads sounded like platoons. Their platoons sounded like companies. You would prepare for a major assault and find yourself facing a handful of men. You would dismiss a contact as a minor probe and discover a full company advancing through your position. I stopped trusting my ears. I stopped trusting anything. Every American contact became a potential disaster because I could never be certain how many we faced. A dozen men who sound like 50 men create fear that 50 men alone could not create. The Americans understood this. They used it against us, and we never found a way to overcome it. Gefreiter Wilhelm Brenner, the same soldier who had testified about the Hürtgen forest, offered a final observation that captured the totality of the German experience. We were the best infantry in the world. We had the best machine guns, the best training, the best tactical doctrine. We had proven this in Poland, in France, in Russia. We believed infantry combat was a problem we had solved. The Americans solved it differently. They solved it better. Their solution was simpler than ours. Give every man a rifle that fires fast, train him to use it without hesitation, and let the mathematics of firepower do the rest. We lost tens of thousands of men because we could not believe what our ears were telling us. We committed reserves against platoons. We fortified positions against companies that turned out to be squads. We did these things because our experience, our training, our entire understanding of infantry combat told us that the fire we were hearing could only come from the forces we estimated. Our understanding was wrong, and by the time we accepted this, there was no army left to apply the lesson. The American infantry had achieved something unprecedented. They had systematically deceived German tactical intelligence not through camouflage or disinformation, but through the simple application of superior firepower. Every engagement produced the same result. German commanders estimating American strength based on the fire they received. German reserves committed against phantoms. German plans disrupted by a capability gap that no amount of combat experience could close. The doctrine that Marshall and his colleagues had developed at Fort Benning in the 1930s had proven itself in the ultimate test. Volume of fire worked. Fire superiority worked. Making every rifleman a weapon unto himself worked. It worked so well that the enemy never stopped being surprised by it, even as the evidence accumulated that their assumptions were fatally flawed. The American infantry did not merely defeat the Wehrmacht. They confused it, deceived it, and overwhelmed it with a sound that could not be trusted. The sound of a dozen men producing fire that should have come from 100. The sound of a new kind of infantry. The sound of victory, May 1945, a holding facility near Reims, France. Lieutenant Gerhard Hoffmann sat across a wooden table from an American intelligence officer, answering questions about the Ardennes offensive that had begun 5 months and a lifetime ago. The questions were routine: unit designations, commander names, equipment counts, the administrative archaeology of a defeated army. Hoffmann answered mechanically, his mind elsewhere. Then the American asked a question that made him pause. At Lanzerath in December, your unit was delayed for nearly 20 hours by American forces at a crossroads. Our records indicate the position was held by 18 men. Your after-action report estimated you faced a reinforced company. Can you explain the discrepancy? Hoffmann stared at the American for a long moment. 18 men. He had known the truth for months, had learned it from subsequent intelligence reports, from prisoner interrogations, from the slow accumulation of evidence that everything he had believed about American infantry was wrong. But hearing it stated so plainly, in the flat voice of a victor recording the details of his victory, made the truth feel new again. 18 men, Hoffmann repeated. 18 men, the American confirmed. Understrength intelligence and reconnaissance platoon. They held your division's advance for almost a full day. Hoffmann thought about that morning in the Ardennes. The darkness, the cold, the sound of gunfire from the crossroads that had convinced him, that had convinced his captain, his battalion commander, the entire chain of command, that they faced a force 10 times larger than actually existed. The fire, Hoffmann said finally, the volume of fire. It was continuous, unceasing. We had been trained to estimate enemy strength by sound, by rate of fire, by the rhythm of engagement. Everything we heard told us we faced a company, perhaps more. But you faced 18 men. Yes. Hoffmann's voice was barely audible. 18 men who sounded like 150. 18 men who made us call for reinforcements, delay our advance, reorganize our assault formations. 18 men who gave your army time to prepare the defenses that stopped our offensive. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had trembled while gripping binoculars in the December darkness, trying to make sense of a sound that defied everything he understood about combat. How did they do it? Hoffmann asked, though he already knew the answer. How did 18 men produce fire like that? The American officer smiled slightly. They were trained to. Trained to. 3 words that captured a doctrinal revolution 20 years in the making. 3 words that explained thousands of German casualties, hundreds of failed assaults, an entire offensive derailed by a platoon at a crossroads. The Germans had built the finest machine gun-centric infantry in the world. They had conquered Europe with it. They had believed it was the ultimate expression of modern infantry doctrine, the final answer to the question of how small units should generate killing power. The Americans had found a different answer. They had looked at the same problem and reached a different conclusion. They had decided that the machine gun was not the only path to fire superiority. They had decided that every rifleman, properly equipped and properly trained, could be a source of suppressive fire. They had built an infantry force around this insight and sent it to Europe, and it had broken the Wehrmacht. Not alone. Tanks had mattered, artillery had mattered, air power had mattered, logistics had mattered. But in the close fights, in the hedgerows and forests and village squares where infantry met infantry, the American doctrine of fire superiority had proven decisive. German units had consistently faced what sounded like overwhelming force and discovered too late that they had been deceived by the simple mathematics of semi-automatic rifles in trained hands. Lieutenant Hoffmann returned to Germany in 1946. He became a school teacher, then a local government official, then a retired pensioner who rarely spoke about the war. But when his grandchildren asked him about his service, as grandchildren always do, he would tell them one story. He would tell them about a December morning when he lay in frozen earth, listening to American rifles, convinced he faced an army. There were 18 of them, he would say, shaking his head even decades later. 18 Americans held a crossroads against a division. They did it by sounding like more than they were. They did it because their rifles fired faster than we could count, because their training taught them to never stop shooting, because their doctrine said that fire superiority was worth any amount of ammunition. We had the best machine guns in the world. They made every soldier a machine gun. We thought quantity was the answer to firepower. They made quality the answer instead. Quality of weapon, quality of training, quality of doctrine. And the sound those 18 men produced stopped an offensive that was supposed to win the war. He would pause then, and his grandchildren would wait, knowing he was seeing something they could not see. A crossroads in the Ardennes, a wall of fire from a handful of rifles, the moment when German certainty shattered against American innovation. We built our infantry around a weapon, Hoffmann would conclude. They built their infantry around an idea, the idea that every soldier should generate the maximum possible fire from the first moment of contact. The idea that suppression was not the job of the machine gun team, but the job of every man in the unit. The idea that volume of fire, sustained and overwhelming, could break any attack and hold any position. It was a better idea than ours. We learned this the hard way. We learned it in blood. The M1 Garand remained in American service until 1957. The doctrine it enabled, fire superiority through individual weapon capability, shaped American infantry operations through Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. The fundamental insight that Marshall and his colleagues developed at Fort Benning in the 1930s proved so effective that it has never been abandoned, only refined. Give every soldier maximum firepower, train him to use it aggressively, and let the mathematics of suppression do the rest. The Germans had entered the war with the best infantry tactics in the world, tactics that had conquered Poland in weeks, France in months, and driven to the gates of Moscow in a single campaign season. They had believed these tactics represented the pinnacle of military evolution, the final word in how infantry combat should be conducted. They were wrong. The Americans had found something better. Not better equipment, though the Garand was an extraordinary weapon. Not better soldiers, though American infantrymen proved themselves the equal of any in the world. Better doctrine, a way of thinking about infantry combat that multiplied the effectiveness of every man who carried a rifle. 18 men at a crossroads, a sound that could not be trusted, a lesson that cost the Wehrmacht an offensive and, ultimately, a war. The Germans had counted machine guns to estimate strength. They had listened for the rhythm of bolt-action rifles, the pause between shots that revealed the truth about enemy numbers. They had trusted their ears, their training, their experience. The Americans taught them to trust nothing. Every engagement sounded larger than it was. Every firefight produced more fire than European doctrine predicted. Every German estimate was wrong because the Americans had changed the rules, and the Germans never fully adapted to the new reality. In the end, it was not the number of soldiers that mattered, it was the sound they made. And the Americans had learned to make a sound like thunder. 11 men in a hedgerow ditch, holding against 40. 8 soldiers in a forest clearing, repelling a company. 18 paratroopers at a crossroads, delaying a division. The mathematics of European warfare said these things were impossible. American infantry doctrine made them routine. The Germans came to fear that doctrine, to fear the continuous roar of rifles that never paused for bolt manipulation, the wall of fire that erupted from positions that should have held a handful of men, the impossible sound of an army where only a squad existed. They came to fear it because they could not answer it. They could not match the American rate of fire. They could not adjust their tactics fast enough. They could not unlearn the assumptions that had served them so well against every other enemy. They could only listen to the sound of American rifles and wonder, every time, how many they truly faced. The answer was always fewer than they thought. And that answer was always too late to matter. The Americans had built an infantry that sounded like an army. And in war, what sounds like an army might as well be one.